Welcome, dear listener, to a gentle journey through time, where ancient roads wind through olive groves and fishing boats rest quietly on moonlit waters. Let yourself drift into this peaceful story of wonder and compassion, where ordinary moments become extraordinary, and simple acts of kindness transform the world around us. Close your eyes, breathe softly, and allow these words to carry you to a place of serenity and hope. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty paths of Galilee as fishermen mended their nets by the water's edge. The air was filled with the gentle lapping of waves against weathered boats, the distant bleating of sheep on hillsides, dotted with ancient olive trees, and the soft murmur of voices carrying on the warm breeze. This was a land where time moved slowly, where the rhythm of life followed the seasons and the tides, where people lived close to the earth and closer still to their hopes for something greater than themselves. In the small towns scattered across this peaceful countryside, life unfolded with the predictable comfort of generations past. Bakers rose before dawn to knead their bread, their ovens filling narrow streets with the warm scent of fresh loaves. Shepherds led their flocks to green pastures, their staffs clicking against stones worn smooth by countless footsteps. Women gathered at wells in the cool of evening, their clay jars balanced gracefully on their shoulders as they shared the news of their families and villages. Among these simple, hard-working people, word had begun to spread of a teacher who spoke with unusual wisdom and gentleness. Some called him Rabbi, others simply listened in wonder as his words painted pictures of hope and healing. His followers were ordinary folk, fishermen with calloused hands, tax collectors seeking redemption, women who had known sorrow, and children who sensed something special in his presence. Simon Peter, a fisherman whose boat had known both abundant catches and empty nets, found himself drawn to this teacher's voice. The way he spoke of God felt different from the stern pronouncements they heard in synagogues, warmer somehow, more personal, as if he knew each listener's heart intimately. James and John, brothers whose father Zebedee had taught them to read the weather and the water, left their nets to follow this gentle rabbi, whose eyes seemed to hold depths greater than any sea. Matthew, who had spent his days counting coins and calculating taxes, discovered that numbers meant little compared to the richness of compassion. Mary Magdalene, who had known darkness in her soul, found light in the teacher's presence. Thomas, ever practical and questioning, stayed close because something in the rabbi's manner convinced him that truth was being revealed, even when his mind couldn't fully grasp it. As they travelled together through the countryside, these followers learned that their teacher saw the world differently. Where others might pass by a beggar without a second glance, he would stop and truly see the person's need. When children ran to him, he didn't wave them away, but welcomed them with the kind of smile that made them feel important and loved. His hands, carpenter strong yet infinitely gentle, had a way of blessing whatever they touched. The days fell into a peaceful rhythm of walking and talking, of sharing simple meals and sleeping under stars that seemed to shine more brightly in his presence. They would wake to the sound of birdsong and find him already awake, sometimes in prayer, sometimes simply watching the sunrise with an expression of quiet joy. His voice would rise softly in the morning air, teaching them to see God's love in every blade of grass, every flower that bloomed in the meadows, every face they encountered along their journey. The roads they travelled were ancient pathways worn smooth by pilgrims and merchants, connecting small villages where life moved at the pace of the seasons. Olive groves provided shade during the heat of the day, their silver-green leaves rustling in breezes that carried the scent of wild herbs and distant cooking fires. Wells marked the resting places where travellers would pause to refresh themselves and share news from other towns. In these peaceful moments between villages, the teacher would often speak in stories that lingered in the mind long after the words were spoken. He talked of seeds that grew mysteriously in the night, of lost sheep found by loving shepherds, of fathers who waited patiently for wayward sons to come home. His parables painted pictures that even children could understand, yet held depths that the wisest elders pondered long into the evening. As word of his teaching spread, people began to seek him out, not just for his words, but because something extraordinary seemed to happen wherever he went. The sick found comfort in his presence, the sorrowful discovered reasons for hope, and those who had lost their way seemed to remember who they truly were. There was a quality of peace that surrounded him, a sense that in his company all things were possible and all hurts could be healed. The changing of seasons marked their journey through that first year together. Spring brought wildflowers to the hillsides and new lambs to the flocks. Summer warmed the waters of the great lake where they often travelled by boat, the disciples learning to navigate not just by stars and wind, but by the calm presence of their teacher. Autumn painted the vineyards gold and purple, and winter brought cosy evenings around fires where stories were shared and hearts were warmed by something more than flame. It was during these quiet times that the disciples began to sense they were part of something larger than themselves. The teacher's love seemed to expand their own capacity for compassion. His peace settled into their hearts like still water in a deep well. His joy became contagious, spreading through crowds like sunlight breaking through clouds after a storm. Young children would spot him from a distance and come running, their laughter echoing off hillsides. Elderly people would lean forward to catch his words, their eyes brightening with hope they thought they had lost. Women who had been marginalized found themselves welcomed into conversations, their insights valued, and their dignity restored. Men who had grown cynical discovered that wonder could return to their hearts. The ordinary moments of their journey were filled with small miracles, moments when understanding dawned in someone's eyes, when forgiveness replaced bitterness, when fear gave way to trust. These everyday transformations prepared their hearts for the greater wonders that were yet to come. They learned that miracle was not so much about the impossible becoming possible, but about love making all things new. As they approached the small town of Cana one particular morning, the air was filled with the scent of flowers and the sound of celebration. Wedding preparations were underway and the whole community buzzed with excitement. Children ran through the streets with ribbons in their hair. Women carried baskets of fresh bread and fruits, and men arranged benches and tables in the courtyards. The joy was infectious, and even the travellers found their steps quickening with anticipation. The wedding celebration in Cana unfolded like a tapestry woven from joy and tradition, each thread representing generations of custom and the simple human need to mark life's precious moments with community and gladness. The bride's house had been transformed with garlands of flowers and palm branches, their sweet fragrance mixing with the aroma of roasting lamb and fresh bread baking in clay ovens that had been built especially for the occasion. As the sun climbed higher in the morning sky, guests began arriving from neighbouring villages, their donkeys laden with gifts and their hearts full of anticipation. Extended families who saw each other only at such gatherings embraced with tears of joy. Children who were cousins ran together in games that transcended the months of separation, and elderly relatives settled into places of honour where they could oversee the festivities with satisfaction and pride. The courtyard where the celebration would take place had been swept clean and decorated with the finest cloth the family could afford. Long tables groaned under the weight of abundant food, platters of dates and figs, bowls of olives glistening with oil, fresh cheese wrapped in grape leaves, and honey cakes that the women had been preparing for days. The centrepiece of the feast was the roasted lamb, its skin crackling and golden, filling the air with a richness that made stomachs growl in anticipation. Musicians tuned their instruments in a corner of the courtyard, a lyre whose strings caught the light like silver threads, small drums with skins stretched tight for the rhythmic heartbeat of celebration, and flutes carved from olive wood that would soon fill the air with melodies both ancient and joyful. Children gathered around them, eyes wide with wonder, some bold enough to reach out tentative fingers to touch the mysterious instruments that could create such beautiful sounds. The bridegroom, dressed in his finest robe with a crown of flowers on his head, moved through the crowd with the nervous energy of a man whose life was about to change forever. His friends surrounded him with jokes and encouragement, their laughter rising above the general buzz of conversation. His eyes kept searching the crowd for glimpses of his bride, who remained modestly in her family's house, being prepared by the women for her grand entrance. As the teacher and his disciples approached the celebration, they were welcomed with the warm hospitality that marked these rural communities. Water was brought for washing their dusty feet, fresh bread was placed in their hands, and cups of wine were offered to refresh them from their journey. The mother of Jesus, who had family connections to the wedding party, moved gracefully through the crowd, ensuring that every guest felt welcomed and cared for. The ceremony itself was a thing of beauty and reverence. When the bride finally appeared, dressed in white with a veil that had belonged to her grandmother, a hush fell over the gathered crowd. Her beauty was radiant, but more than physical appearance. She glowed with the joy of a woman entering into love and partnership. The ancient words were spoken, blessings were pronounced, and the community witnessed another link being forged in the chain of human connection that bound them all together. As afternoon melted into evening, the celebration reached its peak. The musicians began to play in earnest, their melodies lifting hearts and inspiring feet to dance. Young and old joined hands in circles that moved with the rhythm of generations, their laughter and singing creating a symphony of human happiness that seemed to rise to heaven itself. The elderly clapped from their seats, their eyes twinkling with memories of their own wedding celebrations, while children wove between the dancers like happy spirits. The wine flowed freely, as was customary at such celebrations. In a culture where water was often unsafe to drink, wine was a blessing that marked special occasions and sealed important moments. It represented abundance, joy, and the goodness of God's creation. The fermented juice of grapes that had been tended with love, harvested with gratitude, and transformed through time into something that could lift the spirit and warm the heart. But as the celebration continued into the night, a problem began to emerge that threatened to cast a shadow over the joyous occasion. The steward of the feast, responsible for ensuring that all the guests were properly cared for, noticed with growing concern that the wine was running low. In a culture where hospitality was sacred and a wedding celebration was expected to last for days, running out of wine would be more than embarrassing. It would be a social catastrophe that would follow the family for years to come. The mother of Jesus, with the intuition that comes from years of caring for others, sensed the growing anxiety among the servants. She watched as they whispered urgently among themselves, their earlier joy replaced by worry about what would happen when the last jar was emptied. The shame that would fall upon the groom's family weighed heavily in the air, a stark contrast to the continuing laughter and dancing of the guests who remained unaware of the crisis developing behind the scenes. With the quiet confidence of a woman who had seen her son grow from a gentle child into a man of extraordinary wisdom and compassion, she approached him where he sat among his disciples. Her words were simple but carried the weight of a mother's faith and the urgency of human need. She explained the situation without drama or fanfare, simply presenting the problem to her son with the trust that came from years of watching him care for others with unfailing love. The teacher's response was gentle, but seemed to suggest that this was not yet his time to act in the way she hoped. Yet she sensed something in his manner, a subtle softness in his refusal that told her to wait and watch. And, with the wisdom of mothers throughout history, she turned to the servants and gave them instruction that would echo through the ages. Whatever he tells you to do, do it. Near the edge of the courtyard stood 6 large stone jars, each capable of holding 20 or 30 gallons of water. These vessels were used for the ceremonial washing that religious custom required before meals, their size testament to the number of guests the family had expected to welcome. They stood empty now, having been used throughout the day as guests arrived and prepared themselves for the feast. The teacher rose from his place among the disciples and approached the servants with the same gentle authority that marked all his interactions. His instructions were simple and clear. Fill the jars with water. The servants, remembering the mother's words and sensing something profound in the teacher's presence, obeyed without question. Back and forth they went to the well, carrying pitcher after pitcher of clear, cool water, until all 6 massive jars were filled to the brim. The water sparkled in the light of the torches that now illuminated the courtyard, as darkness settled over the celebration. It was ordinary water, drawn from the same well that had served the community for generations. blessed by nothing more than the work of human hands and the mysterious command of the gentle teacher. Yet, as it rested in those stone vessels, something extraordinary was taking place, a transformation that spoke to the heart of all creation's potential for renewal and wonder. When the jars were full, the teacher gave a second instruction that seemed to make no sense in the natural order of things. Draw some out and take it to the master of the feast. The servants looked at each other with uncertainty, but the authority in his voice was quiet and absolute. They dipped their vessels into what they had filled with water and carried it to the man who was responsible for overseeing the celebration. The master of the feast, unaware of the crisis that had been developing or the miracle that had just occurred, tasted what was brought to him with the practiced palate of a man accustomed to judging the quality of wine. His eyes widened with surprise and delight as he recognized not just wine, but wine of extraordinary quality, rich, complex, with flavors that spoke of the finest grapes and the most careful preparation. Following the protocol of such celebrations, he called for the bridegroom and spoke words that would be remembered long after the wedding flowers had faded and the last guest had gone home. With genuine amazement in his voice, he praised the groom for reversing the usual custom of serving the best wine first and lesser quality later in the evening. This wine, he declared, was the finest he had ever tasted, worthy of being saved for the most important moment of the celebration. The bridegroom accepted the praise with bewilderment, having no idea what had transpired. But the servants knew, and word began to spread through the crowd like ripples across a still pond. The teacher, who had continued to sit quietly among his disciples as if nothing unusual had happened, found himself the center of amazed whispers and wondering glances. The celebration continued with renewed joy, the crisis averted and the abundance restored. But something had changed in the atmosphere of the gathering. There was a sense of having witnessed something beyond the ordinary, a feeling that grace had visited them in a way both subtle and profound. The wine that flowed now was not just fermented grape juice, but liquid joy, transformed water that carried within it the promise that all things could be made new. As the disciples sat in the flickering torchlight, they found themselves looking at their teacher with new eyes. They had seen his compassion, heard his wisdom, felt the peace that surrounded him. But this gentle miracle, so quietly performed, so perfectly timed, so generously given, revealed dimensions of his character that left them breathless with wonder. The mother of Jesus smiled softly as she watched her son continue his quiet conversation with those around him, giving no sign that he had just performed an act that defied the natural order. She had known since his birth that he was special, had treasured moments and words in her heart for 30 years, waiting for the time when the world would begin to see what she had always known. This moment, she sensed, was the beginning of that revelation. The wedding celebration would continue for several more days, as was the custom, but the miracle of the wine had transformed it into something more than a social gathering. It had become a parable acted out in real life, a demonstration that God's love could meet human need in the most practical and generous ways. The abundance of wine spoke of divine provision that exceeded expectation, grace that transformed the ordinary into the extraordinary. As the night grew deeper and the music softer, couples danced slowly in the torchlight, while children fell asleep in their parents' arms. The elderly shared stories of their own youth while young people dreamed of their futures, and through it all the wine flowed, wine that had been water just hours before, wine that carried within its transformed essence the promise of greater miracles yet to come. The teacher and his disciples eventually found places to rest for the night, gratefully accepting the hospitality of their hosts. As they settled onto sleeping mats under the star-filled sky, they carried with them not just the memory of a wonderful celebration, but the beginning awareness that they had been chosen to witness wonders that would change their understanding of what was possible in this world. In the quiet hours before dawn, as the last of the wedding guests finally sought their rest, and the courtyard grew still except for the soft snoring of sleeping children and the distant sound of night birds, the stone jars stood as silent witnesses to the miracle. Empty now, they held only the memory of transformation. Water become wine, ordinary become extraordinary, human need met by divine love. as the first light of morning began to touch the hills around Cana, painting the sky with gentle colours of rose and gold, the teacher and his disciples prepared to continue their journey. They would carry with them the joy of the celebration, the warmth of human fellowship, and the growing certainty that they were part of something magnificent and mysterious. The road ahead stretched through countryside, awakening to another day, but now they walked with hearts open to wonder and eyes alert for the miraculous hiding in the ordinary moments of life. The wedding at Cana had ended, but its meaning would ripple outward through time like stones dropped in still water. The wine that had been water would become a story told and retold, a sign that pointed beyond itself to greater truths about love's power to transform and grace's ability to provide. And as the small wedding party in an obscure village gradually returned to normal life, the teacher and his followers moved forward into a future bright with possibility and rich with promise. The road that led away from Cana wound gently through hills carpeted with wild grass and dotted with ancient oak trees whose branches had sheltered travellers for countless generations. Morning dew still clung to the leaves, creating tiny prisms that caught the early sunlight and scattered it in rainbow fragments across the path. The air was sweet with the scent of blooming almond trees, and the distant fragrance of bread baking in village ovens carried on breezes that seemed to whisper of new beginnings and unfolding mysteries. As they walked, the disciples found themselves changed by what they had witnessed. Their conversations carried a new quality of wonder. Their steps seemed lighter despite the dusty miles, and their eyes looked upon the world around them with fresh expectation. They had always known their teacher was special, but the quiet miracle at the wedding had opened their hearts to possibilities they had never dared imagine. Peter, whose weathered hands knew every knot and net in his fishing boat, found himself marvelling at hands that could transform water into wine with nothing more than a word. John, youngest among them, walked closer to the teacher now, his young heart hungry for more of the love he had glimpsed in that moment of transformation. Thomas, ever practical, pondered the impossibility of what he had seen, while his soul sang with the reality of what he had experienced. The landscape through which they travelled was a living tapestry of God's creation. Olive groves climbed the hillsides in neat rows, their silver-green leaves shimmering in the gentle breeze. Shepherds led their flocks across meadows where wildflowers painted the grass in shades of purple, yellow, and white. Wells marked the resting places where communities had gathered for generations, their cool waters reflecting the endless blue of the Galilean sky. In each village they entered, word of their coming had somehow preceded them. Perhaps it was the wedding guests who had returned home with stories of the miracle, or maybe it was simply the way good news travels on the wind in communities where people know each other's hearts. Children would run out to meet them on the paths, their laughter echoing off stone walls and their joy infectious to all who heard it. The teacher would pause in these encounters, never too busy to notice a child's smile or answer an elder's question. His presence seemed to slow time itself, creating moments of peace in the midst of busy lives. When he spoke to a worried mother about her sick child, his words carried comfort that went deeper than medicine. When he listened to a farmer's concerns about his struggling crops, his compassion transformed anxiety into hope. They visited synagogues where the teacher would read from ancient scrolls with a voice that made familiar words come alive with new meaning. The scriptures that people had heard since childhood suddenly revealed depths they had never noticed, promises they had never grasped, love they had never fully understood. His teaching was like water poured on ground that had been waiting for rain, causing seeds of faith to sprout in hearts that had grown dry with routine and doubt. The marketplaces where they stopped became theatres of gentle transformation. Merchants who had spent their days calculating profits found themselves drawn into conversations about treasures that could not be counted in coins. Women who had come to buy bread for their families lingered to hear words that fed their souls. Beggars who had positioned themselves to ask for money discovered they were receiving something far more valuable: dignity, recognition, and the radical idea that they too were beloved children of God. As spring deepened into early summer, their travels took them through regions where the landscape told stories of both abundance and struggle. Fertile valleys where grain grew tall and green spoke of God's provision, while rocky hillsides reminded them that life required patience and perseverance. Rivers ran clear and cold from mountain springs, providing refreshment for both body and spirit, while dusty paths tested their endurance and deepened their appreciation for shade and rest. The nights were spent sometimes in the homes of generous hosts, sometimes camping under stars that seemed to shine with unusual brightness. Around evening fires, the teacher would tell stories that lingered in the mind long after sleep came. His parables painted pictures that even children could understand, yet held mysteries that kept adults thinking for days. A mustard seed becoming a mighty tree, a woman searching for a lost coin, a father waiting for a wandering son to come home. Simple images that carried profound truths about God's kingdom. During these quiet evening hours, the disciples began to understand that they were receiving an education unlike any offered in the schools of Jerusalem. They were learning not just facts about God, but how to see God's presence in every moment of ordinary life. The way their teacher treated a crying child, welcomed a despised tax collector, or blessed a simple meal became lessons in love that no scroll could contain. The rhythm of their days created its own form of worship. Morning prayers as the sun painted the eastern hills, meals shared with grateful hearts, conversations that revealed God's truth in unexpected places, and evening rest that came with the satisfaction of lives lived in service to something greater than themselves. They were discovering that the kingdom of God was not a distant place, but a present reality that could transform any moment, any encounter, any heart open to receive it. In one particular town, they encountered a man who had lived his entire life in a darkness deeper than any night. Born without sight, he had never seen the sunrise paint the hills gold, never watched children play in the dusty streets, never looked into the eyes of someone who loved him. His world was one of sounds and textures, of voices and touches, of memories built from everything except the gift of vision that others took for granted. This man had positioned himself, as was his daily custom, near the town gate where travellers and merchants would pass by. His weathered hands held a simple clay bowl, and his voice would call out hopefully to those who passed, asking for whatever charity their hearts might provide. He had learned to identify regular passers-by by their footsteps, to gauge the mood of potential givers by the tone of their voices, and to express gratitude for even the smallest gifts with a sincerity that touched many hearts. The sounds of the town were his daily companions, the braying of donkeys carrying loads to market, the chatter of women gathering at the well, the laughter of children playing games in the shade of buildings, the calls of merchants advertising their wares. He knew the rhythm of each day by these familiar sounds, could tell time by the changing patterns of noise and activity, and had created a rich inner world built from the symphony of life that surrounded him. Over the years, people had grown accustomed to seeing him there, a permanent fixture of the community. Some passed by with hurried steps and averted eyes, uncomfortable with the reminder of human vulnerability that his presence represented. Others stopped regularly to place a coin in his bowl or offer a kind word, their generosity born from compassion or religious duty or simple human kindness. A few had taken time to truly know him, learning his name and his story, treating him not as an object of pity but as a person deserving of dignity and respect. His family had loved him from birth, but his blindness had shaped their lives in ways both profound and practical. His mother had learned to describe the world to him in words, painting pictures of sunsets and flowers and faces with a poet's attention to detail. His father had guided his hands to understand shapes and textures, teaching him to navigate the world through touch and sound and memory. Siblings had been his eyes in childhood games, his protectors in crowds, his advocates when others misunderstood or mistreated him. The religious leaders of his community had struggled to understand his condition through the lens of their theology. Some saw his blindness as punishment for sin, either his own or his parents', a harsh judgment that added spiritual burden to physical limitation. Others viewed him as an object lesson, a recipient of charity that would earn merit for the giver, but remained somehow outside the full circle of human community. Few had considered that his blindness might serve a purpose beyond punishment or pity, that his life might have meaning and value that had nothing to do with his physical limitations. As he sat by the gate on this particular day, the man heard familiar voices approaching, the teacher and his disciples whose reputation had spread throughout the region. He had listened to the stories of the wedding miracle, had heard whispers of healings and wonders, and something in his heart had begun to stir with a hope he had hardly dared acknowledge. When their footsteps paused near his place by the gate, his heart began to beat faster with anticipation and fear. The conversation that followed would change not only his life, but the understanding of everyone who witnessed it. When the disciples asked their teacher about the cause of the man's blindness, expecting to hear familiar explanations about sin and punishment, they received instead words that revolutionized their thinking about suffering and purpose. The blindness, they learned, was not punishment, but opportunity, a canvas on which God's glory could be displayed, a life that would reveal divine love in ways that perfect sight could never accomplish. The teacher's approach to the blind man was marked by the same gentle respect he showed to everyone he encountered. There was no drama in his manner, no theatrical gestures or loud proclamations. Instead, there was the quiet dignity of one person recognizing the inherent worth of another, the sacred moment when divine compassion meets human need without fanfare or self-promotion. As the teacher knelt beside him in the dust by the gate, the blind man felt hands that were both strong and tender touch his face with a gentleness that spoke of perfect love. There was something in that touch that communicated more than words could express. Acceptance without condition, love without reservation, and the promise that his long night of darkness was about to end. The healing that followed was both simple and profound, a miracle that restored not just physical sight, but spiritual vision. Not just the ability to see the world, but the capacity to recognize God's presence within it. The moment when sight first flooded his consciousness was beyond any description that human language could provide. Imagine trying to explain color to someone who had never seen, or attempting to describe music to ears that had never heard. Light poured into his awareness like water into a dry riverbed, overwhelming in its intensity yet welcome beyond measure. The first thing he saw was the face of the teacher, and in that face he glimpsed not just human features, but the very essence of divine love made visible. Colors burst into his awareness with an intensity that made him gasp with wonder. The brown of the teacher's eyes held depths that seemed to reflect eternity itself. The white of his robe seemed to glow with an inner light that had nothing to do with the sun overhead. The blue of the sky stretched endlessly above him, vast and beautiful beyond anything his imagination had ever conceived. Even the humble dust beneath his hands revealed itself to be composed of countless tiny particles, each catching and reflecting light in its own unique way. The faces of the disciples surrounding him became a gallery of human emotion. He could see amazement written in their expressions, wonder shining in their eyes, and something else, a growing understanding that they were witnessing not just a healing but a revelation. Peter's weathered features spoke of years spent battling wind and waves, yet now they were softened with tears of joy. John's young face radiated the pure delight of a child seeing magic for the first time. Thomas's practical countenance showed the struggle between skepticism and undeniable reality. But it was not just the miracle of sight itself that transformed the man's world. It was the way his healing became a bridge between his old life and a new understanding of what it meant to be truly seen by God. The crowds that gathered as word of the miracle spread were eager to witness the spectacle, but the teacher's attention remained focused on the man himself, ensuring that he was not overwhelmed by the sudden flood of sensory input and human attention. The religious authorities, when they arrived to investigate the healing, brought with them questions that revealed more about their own spiritual blindness than about the miracle they had come to examine. Their interrogation of the formerly blind man became a study in contrast, his simple, joyful testimony of transformation met by their complex theological objections and bureaucratic skepticism. Where he saw cause for celebration, they found reasons for suspicion. Where he offered praise, they demanded explanations that fit their predetermined categories. His parents, called to testify about their son's condition, found themselves caught between joy at his healing and fear of the religious establishment's disapproval. Their cautious responses reflected the complex social pressures that surrounded any challenge to accepted religious authority. Yet their son's radiant happiness and obvious transformation spoke louder than any careful diplomatic words could express. As the days passed following his healing, the formerly blind man discovered that seeing the physical world was only the beginning of his transformation. His new sight allowed him to observe the subtle interactions between people, the way kindness showed in a gentle smile, how love expressed itself through tender glances, and how fear manifested in averted eyes and hurried steps. He could now see the beauty that his mother had described to him in words, the way morning light painted the hills gold, how flowers decorated the meadows with living colour, and how children's faces lit up with laughter. The teacher and his disciples eventually continued their journey, but the impact of the healing rippled through the community like waves expanding from a stone dropped in still water. The man's testimony became a source of hope for others who struggled with their own forms of blindness. Not just physical limitations, but spiritual darkness, emotional wounds, and the isolation that comes from feeling unseen and uncared for by both God and neighbours. His daily routine transformed completely as he no longer needed to depend on the charity of strangers for survival. Instead, he found meaningful work that utilized both his newfound sight and the wisdom he had gained through years of careful listening and deep thinking. His unique perspective, someone who had lived in both darkness and light, made him a powerful witness to God's transforming love. The miracle had occurred as naturally as sunrise, without fanfare or self-promotion, yet its effects continued to multiply throughout the region. Other miracles began to be reported as people's faith was kindled by witnessing such obvious divine intervention. The sick sought out the teacher with new hope, the troubled brought their burdens with fresh expectation, and the curious came to see for themselves whether the stories they had heard could possibly be true. Through the remaining weeks of summer, the teacher and his disciples travelled from village to village, their reputation preceding them like the dawn light that announces the coming day. They found themselves welcomed not just as teachers or healers, but as bearers of hope to communities that had grown accustomed to accepting limitation and disappointment as permanent features of life. Their presence suggested that perhaps the impossible was possible after all, that divine love was not a distant concept, but a present reality capable of transforming any situation. The roads they travelled became pathways of pilgrimage for people seeking their own encounters with the miraculous. Some came carrying sick relatives on makeshift stretchers, their faith strong enough to believe that proximity to the teacher might bring healing. Others approached with questions that had troubled them for years, hoping to find in his wisdom the answers that had eluded them. Still others simply wanted to be near someone who seemed to carry the very presence of God with him wherever he went. The crowds that gathered around them grew larger with each passing day, creating both opportunities and challenges. The teacher's compassion never allowed him to turn away anyone who sought his help, yet the practical necessities of feeding and managing such large groups required wisdom and organization. The disciples found themselves learning not just about spiritual matters, but about the practical aspects of serving human need on a massive scale. It was during this period of growing popularity and increasing demands that they faced a situation that would test both their faith and their understanding of divine provision. A crowd of thousands had followed them to a remote area, drawn by the hope of hearing the teacher's words and witnessing his healing power. As the day wore on and evening approached, the practical question of food became urgent. The nearest villages were too small to provide for such numbers, and the disciples found themselves facing what seemed an impossible problem. Peter calculated the cost of buying enough bread to feed even a fraction of the crowd and realized that their modest resources were completely inadequate. Andrew discovered a young boy willing to share his simple lunch, 5 small barley loaves and 2 fish. but the gesture seemed almost laughably insufficient in the face of such overwhelming need. The situation appeared hopeless by any conventional calculation. Yet, as they had learned at the wedding in Cana, their teacher operated by different mathematics entirely. His economy was based not on scarcity but on abundance, not on limitation but on infinite divine provision. What seemed impossible to human calculation became an opportunity for divine revelation, a chance to demonstrate that God's love could meet human need in ways that transcended natural law and conventional wisdom. The miracle that followed would become one of the most remembered and retold stories of divine provision in human history. As thousands gathered on the grassy hillside overlooking the Sea of Galilee, they were about to witness a demonstration of God's abundance that would challenge every assumption about limitation and lack. The evening breeze carried the scent of wild herbs and the distant fragrance of fishing boats returning to harbour, creating an atmosphere of peaceful expectation as an extraordinary day moved toward its climactic moment. The teacher's instructions to have the people sit down on the grass created an immediate sense of order and calm in what could have been chaos. Families settled together in groups, children nestled between their parents, and the elderly found comfortable spots where they could rest while remaining part of the larger community. The green hillside became a natural amphitheatre where thousands waited with patient trust, their faith stronger than their hunger, their hope more powerful than their practical concerns. As the teacher took the boy's simple offering into his hands, something profound occurred that went far beyond the multiplication of bread and fish. The act of blessing that preceded the miracle transformed what could have been merely a spectacular display of power into a sacred moment of communion between divine love and human need. His words of thanksgiving acknowledged not just the food itself, but the generous heart of the child who had offered everything he had, demonstrating that God's miracles often begin with human acts of sacrificial love. The distribution of the multiplied food became its own miracle of organization and care. The disciples moved through the seated crowds with baskets that never seemed to empty, ensuring that every person received not just enough to satisfy their hunger, but an abundance that spoke of divine generosity. Children laughed with delight as they discovered their portions were larger than any meal they could remember. Adults sat in wonder as they realized they were participating in something that defied every natural law they understood. The food itself was simple but perfect. Bread with the hearty substance of grain grown in Galilean fields, fish with the fresh taste of the lake that sparkled in the distance. Yet those who ate it later testified that they had never tasted anything more satisfying, as if the miraculous multiplication had enhanced not just the quantity but the very essence of nourishment. Hunger was satisfied not just in their bodies but in their souls, as they recognized they were consuming bread that carried within it the very love of God. As the meal continued, the sense of community that developed among the thousands became almost as miraculous as the food itself. Strangers shared with neighbors, families welcomed solitary individuals into their circles, and barriers of class and status dissolved in the shared wonder of witnessing divine provision. Children ran between the groups carrying extra food to those who needed it, their innocent generosity reflecting the spirit of the boy whose small gift had made the entire miracle possible. When everyone had eaten their fill, the teacher's instruction to gather the leftover fragments revealed another dimension of the miracle. 12 baskets were filled with the remaining pieces, more food than they had started with, abundant proof that God's provision exceeds human need and divine economy operates by principles of surplus rather than scarcity. The careful collection of the fragments also taught a lesson about gratitude and stewardship, showing that even miraculous abundance should not be wasted or taken for granted. As twilight settled over the hillside and the last of the crowd began to disperse to their homes, the disciples found themselves profoundly changed by what they had witnessed. They had seen their teacher's compassion extend beyond individual healing to encompass the physical needs of thousands. They had participated in a miracle that demonstrated God's ability to provide abundantly for human necessity. Most importantly, they had learned that in God's kingdom, small offerings given with love could be transformed into blessings beyond imagination. The young boy, whose lunch had fed the multitude, walked home with his parents, his heart full of wonder at how his simple gift had been used for such an extraordinary purpose. His mother listened to his excited retelling of the day's events, marvelling at how God had chosen her child to play such an important role in revealing divine provision. The boy's generous spirit had become a catalyst for miracle, proving that God often works through the humble offerings of willing hearts. The families who had been fed that day carried home more than satisfied stomachs. They carried testimonies of God's faithfulness that would be shared around countless dinner tables and passed down through generations. Children who had witnessed the miracle would grow up with unshakable faith in divine provision. Adults who had seen the impossible become reality would face future challenges with renewed confidence in God's care. As the evening stars began to appear over the Sea of Galilee, the teacher encouraged his disciples to take their boat and cross to the other side, while he withdrew alone to pray. The day's events, powerful as they had been, had not drained him, but rather deepened his communion with the Father. The quiet hillside, now empty except for the whisper of wind through grass, became his sanctuary for intimate conversation with the source of all miracles. The disciples pushed their boat into the gentle waves, their hearts still overwhelmed by the day's extraordinary events. The familiar rhythm of rowing provided a soothing counterpoint to their racing thoughts as they processed what they had witnessed. The lake stretched before them, its surface reflecting the growing starlight like scattered diamonds on dark silk. This was their element. Peter, Andrew, James, and John had spent countless nights on these waters, reading wind patterns and navigating by stars their fathers had taught them to recognize. But tonight the lake seemed different somehow, charged with the same mysterious energy that had transformed a boy's lunch into a feast for thousands. The water lapped against their boat with a gentle music that seemed to echo the wonder still ringing in their hearts. Their conversation was subdued, each man wrestling privately with the implications of what they had seen, each trying to understand what it meant to be disciples of someone who could command the very elements of creation. As they rowed through the peaceful night, the shoreline they had left behind grew distant, its lights twinkling like earthbound stars. The teacher remained alone on the hillside, a solitary figure silhouetted against the sky, his prayers rising like incense in the still air. There was something profoundly moving about seeing him there, their master and friend in communion with forces beyond their understanding, yet intimately concerned with their daily needs and struggles. The rhythm of their rowing created its own meditation as the disciples worked together to propel their boat across the dark water. Each stroke of the oars sent ripples across the lake's surface, creating patterns that caught and scattered the starlight. The night air was cool against their skin, carrying scents of water and distant shore, of fishing nets drying in village harbours, and wild herbs growing along the rocky coastline. But as the night deepened, the gentle breeze that had blessed their departure began to strengthen into something more challenging. What had started as a pleasant crossing gradually became a test of their seamanship as contrary winds arose from the darkness, pushing against their progress and making each stroke of the oars require greater effort. The lake, which had seemed so peaceful just hours before, began to show its more temperamental nature. Waves that had been gentle ripples grew into swells that rocked their boat with increasing insistence. The disciples found themselves fighting not just against the wind, but against currents that seemed determined to push them off course. Their hands, already tired from the day's activities, began to ache as they gripped their oars more tightly, putting their backs into each stroke with the determination of men who had faced such challenges before. Yet there was something different about this struggle, an intensity that went beyond normal weather patterns, a resistance that felt almost personal. The wind howled around them with a voice that seemed to mock their efforts, while waves slapped against their boat with increasing violence. What should have been a routine crossing had become a battle against elements that seemed uncommonly hostile to their passage. As the hours passed and their progress slowed to an exhausting crawl, the disciples began to feel the weight of their isolation. The teacher was far behind them on the distant shore, invisible in the darkness that now surrounded them completely. Their boat, which had always been their refuge and their means of livelihood, felt suddenly small and vulnerable in the face of the lake's growing fury. Peter strained against his oar, his fisherman's instincts reading the patterns of wind and wave with growing concern. This was not ordinary weather. There was something supernatural about the opposition they faced, as if spiritual forces were testing their faith and endurance. James and John worked in silent rhythm, their brotherhood evident in their coordinated efforts, while Andrew kept watch for any sign of approaching shore or changing conditions. It was in the darkest hour before dawn, when their strength was nearly exhausted and their progress had almost stopped entirely, that something extraordinary appeared on the water. At first, it seemed like a vision born of fatigue and strain, a figure moving across the surface of the lake with impossible ease, walking on water as casually as others walked on solid ground. The disciples rubbed their eyes, certain that exhaustion was creating hallucinations. But as the figure drew closer, they realized with a mixture of awe and terror that their eyes were not deceiving them. Someone was indeed walking on the turbulent waters of the lake, moving with serene confidence through waves that had been battering their boat for hours. The figure seemed to glow with an inner light that made it visible even in the pre-dawn darkness, and there was something achingly familiar about the way it moved. Fear gripped their hearts as they struggled to understand what they were seeing. In their culture, supernatural appearances often brought messages of judgment or doom. The idea of a spirit walking on water filled them with dread, even as part of their minds began to recognize something beloved in the approaching figure. Their voices called out in terror across the water, their words barely audible above the wind and waves. The response that came back to them across the dark water carried a voice they knew as well as their own breathing, words that had comforted them through countless days of uncertainty and challenge. Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid. The familiar tones of their teacher's voice cut through their fear like sunlight through storm clouds, transforming terror into wonder and doubt into recognition. As he drew nearer, walking with impossible grace across waves that continued to toss their boat like a toy, they could see his face clearly in the strange light that seemed to emanate from his presence. This was indeed their master, their friend, their teacher, but revealed now in a way that challenged every assumption they had ever made about the limitations of human existence. He moved across the water's surface as if it were solid ground, each step steady and sure, despite the chaos of wind and wave around him. Peter, impulsive as always, called out across the water with a request that revealed both his faith and his audacity. If his teacher could walk on water, perhaps that same power could be shared with those who trusted completely in his word. The invitation that came back, simple, clear, and full of loving challenge, would test the fisherman's faith in ways he had never imagined possible. The moment when Peter stepped out of the boat became a parable enacted in real life, a demonstration of what becomes possible when faith overcomes fear and trust triumphs over human limitation. His first steps on the water's surface were tentative but successful, each footfall supported by power that defied natural law. For precious moments, he too walked on water, his eyes fixed on his teacher's face, his heart soaring with the joy of the impossible made real. But when the reality of what he was doing struck his consciousness, when the wind and waves registered in his awareness as obstacles rather than simply part of the miraculous moment, doubt crept into his heart, and natural law reasserted its claim. The same water that had supported him moments before suddenly gave way beneath his feet, and he found himself sinking into the dark depths with a cry for help that revealed both his humanity and his continued faith in the one who had made the impossible possible. The hand that reached down to pull him from the water was the same hand that had blessed the bread and fish, that had touched the blind man's eyes, that had transformed water into wine. It was a hand that spoke of rescue and redemption, of second chances and unfailing love. As Peter was lifted back into the boat, dripping and grateful, he carried with him the memory of those miraculous steps and the knowledge that faith could indeed move mountains, or at least enable a fisherman to walk on water. The moment the teacher stepped into their boat, the wind ceased its howling, and the waves settled into peaceful calm. The storm that had battled them for hours simply stopped, as if nature itself recognized the presence of its creator and chose to rest in obedience to his unspoken command. The sudden stillness was almost more miraculous than the walking on water, a reminder that all of creation responded to the voice that had spoken it into existence. In the profound quiet that followed, the disciples sat in their boat as dawn began to paint the eastern sky with gentle colors of rose and gold. The water around them lay smooth as polished glass, reflecting the emerging light in patterns that seemed to dance with joy. Their hearts were too full for words as they absorbed what they had witnessed, not just the miracles themselves, but the revelation of who their teacher truly was. This was no ordinary rabbi, no simple healer or wise man. This was someone who commanded wind and wave, who walked on water as easily as on land, who spoke, and nature obeyed. The shoreline they approached in the growing light was dotted with small fishing villages where smoke was already rising from morning cooking fires. Fishermen were preparing their nets for the day's work, their boats bobbing gently in harbours that showed no sign of the storm that had raged just hours before. The peaceful domesticity of these scenes created a striking contrast to the supernatural events the disciples had experienced through the night. As they pulled their boat up onto the familiar beach, word of their arrival spread quickly through the village. People began gathering along the shore, some having heard rumours of the feeding miracle, others simply drawn by the growing reputation of the teacher and his extraordinary works. Children ran ahead of their parents, their curiosity overcoming any shyness, while elderly villagers moved more slowly but with equal interest in seeing the one who was said to heal the sick and teach with such authority. The teacher's response to the gathering crowd was characteristic, gentle attention to individual needs rather than dramatic public display. He moved among them like a friend rather than a celebrity, stopping to listen to an old woman's concerns about her sick grandchild, blessing infants placed in his arms by hopeful mothers, and speaking words of comfort to those whose faces showed the weight of hidden sorrows. Among those who sought him out during these days was a messenger who had travelled with urgent purpose from the village of Bethany. His face showed the strain of hard riding and desperate concern as he pushed through the crowd, his message too important to wait for a more convenient moment. The words he carried would lead to one of the most profound demonstrations of divine power over death itself, a miracle that would challenge the very foundations of what people believed possible. The message was simple but heartbreaking. Lord, the one you love is sick. These words referred to Lazarus, a dear friend who lived in Bethany with his sisters Mary and Martha. Their home had been a place of refuge and fellowship for the teacher and his disciples, a sanctuary where they could rest from their travels and enjoy the warmth of genuine friendship. The family's love for the teacher was matched only by his affection for them, making the news of Lazarus's illness particularly poignant. Yet the teacher's response to this urgent message seemed puzzling to those who heard it. Instead of immediate departure for Bethany, he remained where he was for 2 more days, continuing his ministry among the crowds, while his friend lay dying. His words about the sickness not ending in death, but serving to glorify God, carried a mystery that his disciples could not yet understand. They had seen him heal many strangers with immediate compassion. Why would he delay when someone he loved was in need? The journey to Bethany, when it finally began, was marked by an undercurrent of tension and foreboding. The disciples knew that traveling so close to Jerusalem carried risks, as religious authorities there had grown increasingly hostile to their teacher's ministry. Thomas, practical and loyal despite his tendency toward pessimism, expressed what many of them felt. If they were going to face danger, they would at least face it together. The landscape through which they travelled gradually changed from the pastoral beauty of Galilee to the more austere hills surrounding Jerusalem. Ancient olive trees twisted their way up rocky slopes, their gnarled branches speaking of centuries of wind and weather. Stone walls marked property boundaries that had been respected for generations, while terraced vineyards created patterns of cultivation that transformed steep hillsides into productive land. As they crested the final hill overlooking Bethany, The sight that greeted them confirmed their worst fears. The village was in the grip of mourning, with the unmistakable signs of a funeral that had already taken place. Professional mourners could be heard wailing in the distance, their voices carrying the ancient lamentations that had marked human loss for countless generations. The teacher's delay, mysterious as it had seemed, had resulted in their arrival 4 days after Lazarus had been laid in his tomb. Martha, the practical sister who had always been quick to take action, came running to meet them on the road while Mary remained at home with the mourners. Her words carried both grief and faith, sorrow at her brother's death, mixed with unwavering belief that even now something could be done. Her declaration that Lazarus would not have died if the teacher had been there was not an accusation, but a statement of absolute confidence in his power to heal. The conversation that followed between Martha and the teacher revealed depths of theology and hope that transformed grief into anticipation. His promises about resurrection were not abstract doctrines, but personal assurances to a heartbroken sister. When he declared himself to be the resurrection and the life, he was not making a philosophical statement, but offering himself as the answer to humanity's deepest fear and greatest enemy. Martha's return to the house to call Mary created a stir among the mourners, who assumed the sisters were going to visit the tomb again. The sight of Mary running to meet the teacher, falling at his feet in the same grief-stricken faith her sister had shown, moved him to tears. These were not tears of helplessness, but expressions of divine compassion that entered fully into human sorrow, even while possessing the power to transform it. The walk to the tomb became a procession of hope and heartbreak, faith and fear walking hand in hand. The mourners followed, their wailing creating a soundtrack of human sorrow that had echoed through every generation since death first entered the world. Yet there was something different about this funeral march, an undercurrent of expectation that suggested the story was not yet finished. The tomb itself was typical of the time and place, a cave carved into rock, sealed with a large stone that required several men to move. It spoke of finality, of the permanent separation between the living and the dead that had marked human experience since the beginning. The smell of death and decay that emerged when the stone was rolled away reminded everyone present of the harsh reality they faced. But the teacher's prayer before the tomb revealed his confidence in the Father's power and his desire that the miracle about to unfold would strengthen faith rather than simply amaze spectators. His words carried across the silent crowd, creating a moment of sacred anticipation as heaven and earth seemed to hold their breath. When he called Lazarus by name, his voice carried an authority that penetrated beyond the physical realm into the very domain of death itself. The command was simple, direct, and irresistible. Come out. These words echoed off the rocks and reverberated through the hearts of everyone present, carrying power that could not be denied by any force in creation. The figure that emerged from the tomb, still wrapped in burial cloths but unmistakably alive, represented the ultimate victory of life over death, love over loss, hope over despair. Lazarus walked out of his grave as naturally as he had once walked through the streets of Bethany, his presence testimony to power that could reverse what seemed irreversible and restore what appeared permanently lost. The reaction of the crowd ranged from overwhelming joy to terrified awe as they witnessed the impossible made real before their eyes. Some fell to their knees in worship, recognizing they were in the presence of divine power. Others wept with relief and wonder, their understanding of reality forever changed by what they had seen. Still others stood in stunned silence, their minds struggling to process an event that challenged every assumption about the nature of life and death. Mary and Martha embraced their brother with tears of joy that washed away the grief of the past 4 days. Their family, torn apart by death, was restored by resurrection power that demonstrated God's ultimate intention for all creation. The mourners who had come to comfort became witnesses to hope, their lamentations transformed into songs of praise. As the word of Lazarus's resurrection spread throughout the region, it created ripples of response that would ultimately contribute to the final confrontation between the teacher and the religious authorities. Some who heard the news became believers, their faith kindled by such undeniable evidence of divine power. Others grew more determined than ever to stop what they saw as a dangerous disruption of established order. But for those who had witnessed the miracle firsthand, the raising of Lazarus became an anchor for faith that would sustain them through the trials ahead. They had seen death itself defeated, had watched love triumph over loss in the most dramatic way possible. No future challenge could shake the confidence of those who had seen a dead man walk out of his tomb at the command of the one who claimed to be the resurrection and the life. The days following the miracle were filled with celebration and wonder, as Lazarus was gradually reintegrated into the life of his community. His presence at meals, his participation in conversations, his simple existence as a living testimony to resurrection power created an ongoing witness that drew visitors from far and wide. People came not just to see the one who had been raised from the dead, but to understand what his restoration might mean for their own hopes of life beyond the grave. Yet even as news of this greatest miracle spread throughout the land, creating waves of faith and opposition in equal measure, the teacher's heart remained tender toward those who suffered in smaller, quieter ways. His compassion extended not only to dramatic cases that would be remembered for generations, but to the daily struggles of ordinary people whose pain was no less real for being common. It was this quality of universal love that led him to seek out those whom society had forgotten or feared. Beyond the borders of respectable communities, in places where the healthy rarely ventured, lived those who carried burdens that isolated them more completely than prison walls. These were the afflicted ones, the untouchables, those whose very presence was considered dangerous to both body and soul. Their suffering was compounded by social exile, religious judgment, and the crushing loneliness that came from being permanently cut off from the warm fellowship of family and community. Among these forgotten souls were those suffering from leprosy, a disease that transformed human beings into living reminders of mortality and decay. The condition began subtly, perhaps with a small patch of discoloured skin or a slight numbness in fingers or toes. But, as it progressed, it stole away sensation, disfigured features and gradually consumed the body while leaving the mind tragically aware of every loss. More devastating than the physical symptoms was the social death that accompanied the diagnosis. Immediate separation from loved ones, exclusion from worship, and condemnation to live among others similarly afflicted in settlements that existed on the margins of civilization. In one such settlement, built at a safe distance from a prosperous trading town, lived a small community of these outcasts. Their dwellings were simple shelters cobbled together from whatever materials they could scavenge or trade for. Rough stones, weathered wood, and animal skins that provided minimal protection from sun and rain. The constant presence of suffering had created among them a unique bond of mutual support, as those who had lost everything in the outside world found new meaning in caring for one another. There was Benjamin, who had once been a successful merchant with warehouses full of goods and a beautiful family home in the city centre. The first signs of his disease had appeared just as his daughter was approaching marriageable age, forcing him to abandon not only his business but any hope of seeing her wedding day. His wife had wept as he gathered his few possessions and walked away from everything he had built, knowing that love could not overcome the cruel necessities of protecting the healthy from contamination. Beside him lived Rachel, whose gentle voice had once led worship in the women's section of the synagogue. Her beautiful hands, now partially deformed by the disease's progress, had once kneaded bread for Sabbath meals and braided her daughter's hair with loving care. The silence that surrounded her now was broken only by the whispered prayers she continued to offer, believing despite everything that God had not forgotten her, even in this place of exile. Young David had been barely 14 when the telltale signs appeared on his face, ending his dreams of following his father's trade as a carpenter. The tools he had been learning to use with growing skill were now forbidden to him, as was any contact with the family that had once delighted in his quick mind and gentle spirit. He had grown to manhood in this place of outcasts, his education consisting of lessons in survival and the bitter wisdom that comes from profound loss. Among the oldest residents was Miriam, whose white hair spoke of many years spent in this unwanted community. She had become something of a mother figure to the newer arrivals, helping them navigate the complex emotions of exile while maintaining hope in the face of seemingly hopeless circumstances. Her stories of life before the disease served as bridges to a world they could no longer inhabit, while her practical wisdom about surviving in their current situation proved invaluable to those still adjusting to their new reality. These and others like them had created their own routines and rituals, their own ways of marking time and celebrating the small joys that could still be found even in such difficult circumstances. They shared what little food they could obtain through begging or the occasional charity of sympathetic souls. They cared for one another's wounds with whatever herbs and remedies they could gather from the wild plants that grew around their settlement. Most importantly, they maintained their dignity and their humanity in the face of a world that had declared them less than human. News of the teacher's miracles had reached even this isolated community, carried by travellers who passed at safe distances, or by former patients who had been healed of lesser ailments and remembered to share hope with those still suffering. The stories seemed almost too wonderful to believe. Blind eyes opened, paralyzed limbs restored, even the dead brought back to life. Could it be possible that such power existed? And if it did, would it extend even to those whom society had written off as beyond help? The debate among the lepers was intense and heartfelt. Some argued that their condition was too severe, their contamination too complete, their exile too permanent for even miraculous power to overcome. Others pointed out that if someone could raise the dead, surely cleansing leprosy was within the realm of possibility. Still others worried that even approaching the teacher would be inappropriate, a violation of the laws that kept them separated from healthy people and a potential source of contamination that could bring harm to the innocent. It was Benjamin who finally articulated what many of them felt but had been afraid to voice. If there was even the smallest chance that healing was possible, didn't they owe it to themselves and their loved ones to seek it out? What did they have to lose by trying? Their situation could hardly become worse, and the possibility of restoration, of returning to families, resuming normal lives, rejoining the community of faith, was worth any risk or humiliation they might face in the attempt. The decision to seek out the teacher was not made lightly or quickly. Days of discussion and prayer preceded their departure from the settlement. They debated the proper approach, how to request healing without violating the laws of separation, how to express their need without causing fear or offense. They prepared themselves for possible rejection, for the likelihood that even miraculous power might not extend to cases as severe as theirs. When they finally set out, it was with the tentative hope of people who had learned not to expect too much from life, but couldn't quite extinguish the flame of possibility that burned in their hearts. They travelled carefully, staying well away from the main roads where they might encounter other people. Their route took them through rocky wilderness areas where wild animals posed more danger than human contact, across streams where they could refresh themselves without contaminating water sources used by others, and finally to the outskirts of the town where they had heard the teacher was staying. The moment of their first glimpse of him was one they would remember for the rest of their lives. He was sitting beneath a large olive tree, surrounded by his disciples and a small crowd of listeners who hung on his every word. The late afternoon sun filtered through the branches above him, creating patterns of light and shadow that seemed to emphasize the peace that radiated from his presence. His voice carried clearly across the distance as he spoke of God's love for all people, of mercy that knew no boundaries, of compassion that extended to every corner of human need. Following the protocols that governed their interaction with healthy people, they stopped at the required distance and called out their condition as a warning to all who might hear. "Unclean! Unclean!" The words that had become their constant burden, the announcement that protected others while proclaiming their own isolation. Yet even as they spoke these words of separation, they began to voice their desperate plea, "Jesus, Master, have mercy on us." The response was immediate and characteristic of all they had heard about this remarkable teacher. instead of drawing back in fear or disgust, instead of hurrying away from the contamination they represented. He turned toward them with the same gentle attention he had shown to every other person who had sought his help. His eyes met theirs across the distance that law and custom required, and in his gaze they saw not rejection, but recognition, not fear, but love, not judgment, but compassion that reached across every barrier society had erected. His instruction was simple and puzzling. "Go, show yourselves to the priests." The words echoed across the space between them, carrying both command and promise. According to the law, lepers who believed themselves healed were required to present themselves to religious authorities for examination and certification of their cleanliness before they could be readmitted to normal society. But they were not yet healed. Their bodies still bore the marks of disease. Their skin still showed the telltale signs that had exiled them from community. Yet something in the teacher's voice compelled obedience. Perhaps it was the absolute authority with which he spoke, or the love that underlied every word he uttered. Perhaps it was simply that they had nothing left to lose, and everything to gain by trusting in his power. Whatever the reason, they turned toward Jerusalem and the temple where the priests performed their examinations, beginning a journey that would test their faith with every step. The transformation began as they walked, so gradually at first that they almost didn't notice it. David felt sensation returning to fingers that had been numb for years, a tingling that spoke of nerves coming back to life. Rachel looked down at her hands and gasped to see the twisted joints straightening, the diseased skin taking on healthy colour. Benjamin touched his face and felt smooth skin where rough patches had been, clear flesh where disfigurement had marked him as untouchable. By the time they reached the outskirts of Jerusalem, their healing was complete and undeniable. The bodies that had been ravaged by disease were restored to perfect health. Skin that had been marked by corruption now glowed with vitality, and limbs that had been losing function were strong and whole again. But more than physical restoration, they experienced the return of hope, dignity, and the precious possibility of rejoining the human community from which they had been exiled. 9 of them continued directly to the temple, eager to complete the ritual requirements that would officially restore them to society. Their joy was understandable, and their urgency appropriate. They had families to reunite with, lives to rebuild, communities to rejoin. The priests who examined them could find no trace of disease, no reason to deny them the certificates of cleanliness that would allow them to return to normal life. But one among them, a Samaritan whose healing was doubly miraculous given his status as both leper and foreigner, chose a different path. His heart overflowing with gratitude, he turned back to find the teacher who had spoken the words that set him free. His voice rose in praise to God as he retraced his steps, his joy too great to contain, his thanksgiving too important to delay even for the completion of legal requirements. When he found the teacher again, he fell at his feet with tears of joy streaming down his newly healed face. His words of gratitude poured forth in a mixture of languages, his native Samaritan dialect mixed with Aramaic phrases he had learned from his fellow sufferers, all woven together with pure emotion that transcended the barriers of speech. Here was worship in its purest form, thanksgiving that came from a heart that had known the depths of despair and now soared in the heights of restoration. The teacher's response to this grateful Samaritan revealed depths of divine heart that his disciples were still learning to understand. His question about the 9 who had not returned was not born of wounded pride, but of genuine concern for those who had missed the opportunity to complete their healing with thanksgiving. Physical restoration without spiritual gratitude was incomplete healing, restoration of body without transformation of heart. The Samaritan's faith, expressed through his return and worship, was declared to be the key to his complete healing. While the others had received cleansing of their disease, he had received something more, restoration of relationship with God that transcended ethnic boundaries and religious divisions. His status as a foreigner, which had made his leprosy doubly isolating, now became a testimony to God's love that knew no limits of race or nationality. As the seasons turned and stories of these miracles spread throughout the land, they created currents of faith and opposition that would ultimately lead to the teacher's final confrontation with earthly powers. But for now, in the peaceful rhythm of ministry and travel, there was time for quieter moments, for simple human connections, for the ordinary experiences that form the foundation of extraordinary revelation. The journey that had begun in Cana with water, transformed into wine, had led through countless villages and hearts, touching lives in ways both dramatic and subtle. Each miracle had been a sign pointing beyond itself to greater truths about God's love, yet each had also been a response to immediate human need, divine compassion, meeting practical struggles with power that transcended natural limitations. As spring returned to Galilee once again, painting the hillsides with wildflowers and filling the air with the promise of new beginnings, the teacher and his disciples found themselves drawn back to the familiar shores of the great lake. The water sparkled in the morning sunlight like scattered jewels, its surface rippled by gentle breezes that carried the scent of blooming trees and fresh grass. This was where their journey together had begun, where simple fishermen had first heard the call to follow, where nets had been abandoned for a different kind of fishing. The fishing boats bobbed gently at their moorings, their weathered hulls and patched sails speaking of countless voyages and hard-won catches. Seagulls wheeled overhead, their cries mixing with the splash of waves against the rocky shore and the distant voices of fishermen preparing for their daily work. It was a scene of timeless tranquility, the kind of peaceful moment that seemed to exist outside the urgent demands of ministry and the growing tensions that surrounded the teacher's work. Peter stood at the water's edge, his eyes scanning the familiar surface with the practiced gaze of a man who had spent his life reading wind and weather, current and depth. His calloused hands remembered the feel of nets and oars, the satisfying weight of a good catch, the frustrating emptiness of a night's work that yielded nothing. There was something in his fisherman's soul that missed the simple clarity of this work, the direct relationship between effort and reward, the honest struggle between human skill and natural forces. Beside him, Andrew and the sons of Zebedee shared similar memories and longings. They had followed their teacher without hesitation, had witnessed miracles that transformed their understanding of reality itself, had learned lessons about God's kingdom that no synagogue school could have taught them, yet part of their hearts remained tied to these waters, to the life they had known before their world was turned upside down by a call to follow. Thomas, practical as always, suggested they take advantage of this peaceful interlude to return briefly to their former occupation. The boat needed maintenance, their fishing skills required practice to remain sharp, and the familiar work might provide a welcome respite from the intense spiritual and emotional demands of recent months. Besides, they had mouths to feed and expenses to meet, and a successful night's fishing could provide both food and income for their small community. The decision to spend the night fishing was made collectively, with the teacher's gentle approval and his promise to meet them on the shore when morning came. As evening settled over the lake, they pushed their boat into the darkening water, their movements automatic with years of practice. The rhythm of rowing, the careful deployment of nets, the patient waiting that fishing required, all of this felt like coming home after a long journey in foreign lands. But as the night wore on, it became clear that this fishing expedition would not follow the familiar patterns of their past experience. Hour after hour passed without a single fish caught. Net after net came up empty, and the confidence born of professional expertise gradually gave way to frustrated bewilderment. These were waters they knew intimately, techniques they had perfected over years of practice, conditions that should have yielded at least a modest catch. Peter's growing frustration was shared by his companions as they moved from spot to spot around the lake, trying different depths and locations without success. The fish seemed to have vanished entirely from waters that had always teemed with life, as if some invisible force was preventing their nets from fulfilling their purpose. By the time dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, they were exhausted, discouraged, and completely empty-handed. It was in this moment of professional failure and personal disappointment that a familiar voice called to them across the water. The figure standing on the shore was barely visible in the early morning mist, but his words carried clearly over the gentle lapping of waves against their boat. "Friends, haven't you any fish?" The question was simple, even obvious, but something in the tone suggested knowledge that went beyond mere curiosity. Their answer was equally simple, but loaded with the frustration of a wasted night. No. That single word carried all their disappointment, their professional pride wounded by failure in the work they knew best, their exhaustion after hours of fruitless labour. They were fishermen who had caught nothing, experts whose expertise had proved useless, seasoned professionals facing the humiliation of empty nets. The instruction that came back across the water seemed almost insulting in its simplicity. Throw your net on the right side of the boat and you will find some. Here they were, experienced fishermen who had tried every technique and location they knew, being advised by someone standing on distant shore to try a slightly different position. Under normal circumstances, such advice would have been politely ignored, or perhaps met with the gentle condescension that professionals show to well-meaning amateurs. But something in the voice, some quality of authority that transcended normal human advice, compelled obedience. Perhaps it was simply that they had nothing left to lose, that their night of failure had exhausted their own resources and left them open to help from any source. Or perhaps, in some deep part of their hearts, they recognized the voice that had called them from these very waters to follow a different path. The net went over the side one more time, deployed with the same practiced motions they had repeated countless times through the night. But this time, almost immediately, they felt the telltale pull that spoke of fish in abundance. What started as a gentle tug quickly became a weight that threatened to overwhelm their boat, a catch so massive that their net strained against the unexpected load. John, youngest and perhaps most spiritually sensitive among them, was the first to understand what was happening. His voice carried wonder and recognition as he spoke the words that explained everything. It is the Lord, the same power that had multiplied bread and fish to feed thousands, that had calmed storms and walked on water, was now filling their nets with abundance that defied every natural law of fishing. Peter's response was characteristically impulsive and endearing. Rather than wait for the boat to reach shore, he threw on his outer garment and jumped into the water, swimming toward the beach with strong strokes born of excitement and love. His eagerness to reach his teacher overcame any concern for dignity or the practical matter of bringing in the catch, demonstrating once again the impetuous devotion that marked his character. Meanwhile, his companions worked to bring both boat and miraculous catch to shore, struggling with a net so full of fish that it seemed impossible it hadn't torn under the weight. The abundance was overwhelming, fish of every size and type that inhabited the lake, more than they could have caught in a month of normal fishing, a demonstration of divine provision that echoed the feeding of the 5,000. When they finally reached the beach, they found that their teacher had prepared a simple breakfast for them. A fire of coals glowed on the sand. Fish were already cooking over the flames, and bread waited to complete the meal. The sight was both practical and profound. The same hands that had worked miracles were now performing the humble service of preparing food. The same voice that commanded storms was now offering the simple hospitality of shared breakfast. The meal that followed was marked by a quality of peace and communion that transcended words. They ate in companionable silence, their hearts full of gratitude for both the miraculous catch and the simple pleasure of sharing food with their beloved teacher. The fish was perfectly cooked, the bread was fresh and satisfying, and the morning air carried the promise of new beginnings and fresh possibilities. As they finished eating and began the practical work of counting and organizing their catch, they discovered that the net contained exactly 153 large fish, a number that spoke of divine precision and intentional blessing. Despite the enormous weight and the strain of bringing such a catch to shore, the net had not torn, remaining intact as a testimony to God's ability to provide abundantly without waste or loss. The miracle of the great catch served multiple purposes beyond the simple demonstration of divine power. For the disciples, it was a return to their roots, a reminder that their calling as fishers of men was built upon the foundation of God's provision and grace. For Peter specifically, it became the setting for a restoration conversation that would heal the wounds left by his denial and confirm his role as a leader among the apostles. But perhaps most importantly, this final miracle in their lakeside ministry served as a perfect circle, bringing them back to where their journey had begun while demonstrating how much had changed. They were still fishermen, but now they understood that the greatest catch was not measured in fish, but in human hearts touched by divine love. They still worked with nets, but now those nets were cast for souls rather than fish. As the sun climbed higher in the morning sky, painting the lake with gold and the surrounding hills with the fresh green of spring, the teacher and his disciples sat together on the shore where their adventure had begun. The boat rocked gently in the shallow water, its hull loaded with silver fish that testified to God's abundance. The nets lay spread on the sand, intact despite their miraculous burden, ready for whatever purpose the future might hold. The peaceful scene spoke of completion and new beginning, of cycles that end where they started, but at a higher level of understanding and faith. They had witnessed water become wine, seen the blind receive sight, watched as thousands were fed from a boy's lunch, experienced the very elements of nature obey their teacher's voice. They had seen death defeated and leprosy cleansed, had participated in miracles that challenged every assumption about what was possible in this world. Yet perhaps the greatest miracle was the transformation in their own hearts, the way simple fishermen had become bearers of divine love, the way ordinary men had been equipped to carry extraordinary news to a world hungry for hope. As they sat beside the lake in the gentle morning light, they carried within themselves the seeds of a movement that would change the world, the living memory of wonders that would inspire faith for generations yet to come. The water lapped peacefully against the shore, the same water that had once supported their teacher's footsteps, the same lake that had been calmed by his voice. In its gentle rhythm was the heartbeat of creation itself, the steady pulse of divine love that sustains all life and makes all miracles possible. And in the hearts of those who had witnessed wonders beyond counting, that same love continued to work its greatest miracle of all, the transformation of human hearts from fear to faith, from doubt to hope, from ordinary lives to extraordinary purpose. As our gentle journey through these moments of wonder draws to its peaceful close, may your own heart be filled with the same quiet confidence that rested upon those disciples beside their lake. In a world that still needs miracles, may you find rest in knowing that divine love continues to work in ways both seen and unseen, transforming ordinary moments into sacred encounters, and ordinary people into vessels of extraordinary grace. Sleep now in peace, dear listener, carried by the same gentle current of love that has flowed through every miracle, every healing, every moment of divine compassion from that ancient time to this very night.